people on the lands in which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. And we as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. And just before I introduce our speaker, Dr. King, I'd like to share a couple of procedural items. The webinar is being recorded. You probably heard that a moment ago and will be posted to AVA's YouTube channel shortly, so you can revisit this and share this webinar. And we certainly know we get far greater reach in the end from this process. And number two, the chat function has been disabled. Throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A function. Is that still the case, Jason?
That it should be possible to post questions in the chat.
Okay, that's what I thought because we were using a different platform at this time. So our normal housekeeping item is a little different. So in contrast to what I just said, let's post your questions in the chat. And the focus of today's webinar is exploring intersections between adversity, socioeconomic, and health inequities among Indigenous women and gender diverse people, and the complexities of strength and resilience. Very excited to hear this talk by Dr. Malcolm King from the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. King is a citizen of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation in Ontario and a health researcher at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. King served as scientific director of the CIHR Institute of Aboriginal People's Health from 2009 to 2017 and is currently the scientific director of the Saskatchewan Centre for Patient-Oriented Research. His research is aimed at improving wellness and achieving health equity for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit through strengths-based approaches that respect self-determination and privilege Indigenous ways of knowing. Honored with a National Aboriginal Achievement Award in 1999, he was elected a Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Sciences in 2016 and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2021. So Dr. King, I'm just so grateful to you for joining us today, and I would love to hand it over to you. I'm just hoping that your slides will be working.
Yes, I've just asked Jason if he could kindly show my slides. I'm also even having difficulty with sharing my screen. So I know he has them, and I'm sure it will work that way.
This is definitely an exercise in resilience.
Yes.
We'll just have to, we'll put our best foot forward here. And Jason, do you have those?
Yes, I will share my screen now, and then please let me know whenever I should advance the slides.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Jason. And thank you, Nicole, for that kind introduction. I am certainly very happy to be part of Webinar Wednesdays. And I realize what I'm about to present may be a little bit different than a lot of what you've heard, just because it comes from the perspective of a male researcher who has lived in a privileged position. You may not necessarily think of me as privileged since I grew up on an Indian reserve, but I grew up on an Indian reserve with a European mother and a First Nations father and a stable family. And I will talk more about determinants of health, but I think you can already appreciate that that's different than a lot of my Indigenous colleagues who did not have that good fortune to grow up in stable environments or the benefit of First Nations and European cultures both. So please go ahead with two more slides, Jason. And the next one. Yeah, so as I said, I had the privilege not only of growing up in my own home territory, but I currently live there. After 50 years of living in other parts of Canada, I was able to move back to Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation during COVID, and I lived there and worked mostly virtually on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of Métis, in what has become Saskatoon. And if you look down to the bottom, I'm a First Nation, white passing, cisgender male raised in a thriving First Nation community. And I approach this topic with as much humility as possible, recognizing that this is a position of privilege in the Indigenous world. So please bear with me. Next slide, please. I will go over this one briefly. I think you need to put it back on, Jason. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I show this slide, and I want to focus on three aspects of it. The couple in the middle are my late parents, Lloyd and Margaret King. Lloyd was a First Nation person, lived on our reserve all his life. He became a teacher. He struggled, but he was resilient himself. He was one of the First Nations people living on a reserve to go to university back in the 1950s. And he was doing so under the Indian Act at the time, which threatened him with essentially expulsion from our reserve if he did so. But he persisted and got permission. My mother, Margaret, came from Switzerland at the end of for the Second World War, met my father and lived out her life on our reserve. If you look at the upper left corner, you'll see that we go back to generations past, and that is my great-great-grandfather, Chief George King, who was the last of our traditional chiefs in the 19th century and the first elected chief. So he really represented that transition from our traditional way of life to modern times, if you like. And then if you look over to the right, we look forward generations, and these are my two granddaughters who live in England. They're very blonde, as you can see, but they also have First Nation status and privilege through my daughter who lives in England. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief overview for those who may not appreciate that the red pies of these charts show the percentage of self-identified Indigenous people in Canada, and the blue are non-Indigenous, and this is from the 2021 census. And you can see we're 5% overall, but we're not evenly distributed. And in the Northern Territories, we're approximately half of the overall population, even much higher in Nunavut. On the prairies, certainly Saskatchewan and Manitoba, we're 17 or 18%, but down in the very populated eastern part of Canada, Ontario and Quebec, we're 2 or 3% of the population, but the absolute numbers actually are highest in Ontario. And of course, that includes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit by self-declaration. Next slide, please. This other graph shows an important thing. The gray line, which is basically flat up to middle age, up to age 65 or so, is the non-Indigenous majority population profile by 5 years. And you can see that it's fairly flat. There's a little bit of a bump still with what was called the baby boom, and then it falls off for both men and women as you get into higher ages. All of the other three lines are for Indigenous people, Métis, First Nations, and Inuit. And you can see that they're much more sloped which is due to two things. It's due to higher birth rates, but also higher mortality, earlier loss of life or lower life expectancy. And by the late Middle Ages and into elderly, there are many fewer Indigenous elderly people than non-Indigenous. Next slide. So I could talk for an hour about the treaties and their effect, but the main point I want to get out of this is that Canada was never conquered by any foreign power, European or otherwise. It was negotiated through a series of treaties. The original one started on the East Coast, as you can imagine, but there were early treaties also on the West Coast. And then in the middle of Canada, and certainly where I lived in Saskatchewan, Alberta, there are the so-called numbered treaties, which occurred only after Confederation. And a lot of Canada is still not even governed by any treaty, and that includes our national capital in Ottawa and much of the province of British Columbia, where the government post-Confederacy didn't see the need for treaties. But there is one important treaty that I want to point out, one of the first ones. Next slide, please, Jason. This is the treaty known as the Two-Row Wampum Belt in English, and in Mohawk or Cayuga language, Geswenta. And it's the treaty between the Six Nations, the Five Nations at the time, and the Dutch, who occupied what became New York State. It was known as New Amsterdam at the time. And it was a treaty that was important and is an exemplary of a good treaty because it's a treaty of non-interference, of mutual respect. And as it says there, it's made of white and purple trade beads. These were very valuable at the time. The purple row represents the sailboat of the Europeans, and the other purple row represents the canoe of the Native Americans. And the three rows of white beads have a significance of peace, friendship, and forever. And the importance of it is that it was a treaty where each side recognized the other's way of life as valid and valuable, and that they agreed not to interfere. Now, ultimately, this, of course, didn't hold, and those modern treaties and the numbered treaties post-Confederation were not treaties for between equals. And I won't dwell on those, but we can go on to the next slide. I'm showing a few highlights of what would be normally, I guess, a 2 or 3 hour webinar. But the Indian Act followed shortly after Confederation in 1876, so 9 years later. And it's still in existence, although it's been modified a number of times. But it defines, it's the government who decides who is recognized as a status Indian, not First Nations themselves. It outlines the rules that govern our reserves. And originally, Indians were considered minors in law. And this went on right up until 1961. And I was born, I can remember this. My father was in his 40s by then, and until 1961, he was considered a minor in law, and he needed official permission to leave the reserve or return. This was relaxed after the 1930s, but this actually served as the model for South Africa, who developed their own pass system, which is famous, I guess, but that really came from Canada. My father and his brothers during the 1930s had to apply and carry a pass in order to leave the reserve to work. There are many other policies, and in particular of interest is the gender discrimination. So until 1985, there was gender discrimination. So when a First Nation woman, when an Indian woman, as they're known, married a non-Indian, a non-Indigenous person, they lost their status. And my father's sisters all lost their status when they married white men, whereas my father not only kept his status by marrying a white woman, my mother, who was Swiss, she gained status as a First Nation, even though she had never been in Canada, hadn't grown up in Canada. And it was a gross discrimination that went on until 1985. So it affected whole families. Half of my family of 30 cousins had status when they were growing up, the other half did not. Many of them subsequently got status back after 1985, but they were adults by then. There was the residential school system, and I'll say more about that. There were bans on religious ceremonies, and that then brings back the Gashwenta, the Tura Wampum. Why wasn't there respect for the indigenous ways of life? And so that's an important thing. There were restrictions on education. My father wasn't allowed to go to university until the mid 1950s, and only then by special permission. We didn't have the right to counsel and no lawyers, and therefore any negotiations were totally one-sided. And the Indian agent was the only person who was considered an adult on our reserve. Next slide. So there's lots to be said about the Indian residential schools, and I won't go into it. I'm sure you probably all know a lot about them. But in 1920, so that's not so long ago, uh, it became mandatory for every Indian child 7 to 16 years. But in fact, even children as young as 4 or 5 were taken away from their families to attend Indian residential schools. And in these schools, they generally lost their language unless they had a way of keeping it in the summers. And many of them never returned even. The disease, tuberculosis in particular, was very prevalent in these overcrowded conditions. Next slide, please. So the residential schools did start to die down in the 1960s, although some of them went on until 1996. But another phenomenon took over in the 60s, and that was with funding transfer agreements. The federal government uh, obliged the provinces to take over child welfare on reserves, and they weren't capable of it. They didn't have the mechanisms. And so what ended up happening is that First Nations children, but also Inuit and Métis, were taken away from their home communities and raised from their cultures, their language, and extended families. The system replaced what had worked for generations, which was informal adoptions. And I'll just mention my oldest cousin, who was born to my father's unwed sister when she was 16, was simply adopted as the youngest child of my grandparents and raised with the other children. That was not possible after the mid 1950s or 1960, children like that were taken away and raised in an unfamiliar environment. And so there were at least 20,000 children who were known. Many of them have passed, but many are still around as a 60 scoop. Next slide. And unfortunately, Indigenous children in foster care continue to be greatly overrepresented. And you can see this statistic from the 2016 census that basically half, a little bit more than half, 52% of children in foster care under age 14 are Indigenous in Canada, yet only 7.7% of all children under that age are Indigenous. So that's a gross overrepresentation. So it continues. And there have been some improvements, and recently some First Nations, such as Cowessess in southern Saskatchewan, have taken over their own foster care system, and that's a great advance. Next slide, please. So the final bit of this negative, and this is all negative, and I understand that. Indigenous people have been vastly overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And for men, it's approximately 7 times the incarceration rate, or maybe not even quite that much, but it's a big thing even for men. But for women, the overrepresentation of Indigenous women in custody is even much greater, not numerically, but percentage-wise. So basically, Indigenous women represent 42% of female custody admissions in provincial, territorial, and 40% in federal. And youth, of course, are also unfortunately overrepresented, and particularly female youth. The next slide, in a way, shows it graphically. So here we were cruising along, at least in a minority position, until 2020. And then what happened in 2020? Well, it was COVID. So government policy said, let's release lower risk prisoners. And you can see that most of the ones who were released, this last drop over the course of the 2 years of COVID, 2020 to 2022, were in the non-Indigenous population. And so we have the unfortunate distinction that since 2022, fully half of female inmates in federal prisons are Indigenous. Next slide. So 2015 marked the end of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work. It started 6 years before. You see Justice Murray Sinclair, Willie Littlechild, and I'm just blanking on her name, but from the Northwest Territories, all much shorter than Prime Minister Trudeau, but they're presenting the final report in December 2015. And the Prime Minister at the time accepted the report and said that everything would be implemented, which of course, unfortunately hasn't happened, although again, there's been a number of things that have come on. Next slide, please. There were 94 calls to action and health calls. I'm not going to deal with them, but I do tell medical students and MPH students about these. The 2 of them are very important and relevant to everyone. Number 18 basically says that the health inequities faced by Indigenous people are largely due to not just residential schools, but the whole gamut of federal and provincial policies in Canada. And number 19 is a call to action in the sense that it says that we collectively, and that includes us as academics, as community activists, as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, need to do something about it. And we need data in order to monitor what we do. I'll just mention number 94 actually was brought to my attention just a couple of days ago because it's to teach our new citizens, the people who are granted citizenship in Canada, about treaties and honoring them. And I have to say that our new citizens in Canada are probably more aware of their obligations as Canadians than native-born Canadians. And so that's something that we still need to work on. Next slide, please. So Indigenous people have different worldviews than non-Indigenous people, and there are many Indigenous worldviews, probably as many as there are groups of Indigenous people in the world. But there are some commonalities that are important, and one of the most important is that we hold this critical bond to land and to nature. So, and you can see that not only the commonality, but clearly the diversity that that bond will be, because somebody whose natural territory is in the far north, the land of snow and ice, a lot of the year, will have a very different worldview than those who come from the southern areas where the climate is much warmer. And yet, our territories, as the second bullet point says, our territory and natural environment are reflected in our knowledge systems and social arrangements. We're part of and interconnected with our landscape. So, and these are reflected in the United Nations definition of who's Indigenous when you really get down to it. You have to have that bond to lands and waters and the air even somewhere on the globe and be connected with that landscape. There's other important things, experiential knowledge, holistic, ecological. Kinship is important, and that's why I think we all look forward and backward. We look to our ancestors for guidance, and we look forward to the people who will follow us. And we often talk about 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And time is cyclical and synchronical. Next slide, please. There are two important concepts that we as health researchers embody, and they look a bit similar, but they're operationally quite different. One came from an Indigenous scholar in Saskatchewan who is not only a philosopher and a retired professor, but also a lodge keeper in his own community, Willie Ermine of Sturgeon Lake First Nation. And he described in his thesis from 2 decades ago the ethical space of engagement, where a group with a Western worldview and a group with an Indigenous worldview meet and need to explore this ethical space that would otherwise separate them in order to be able to move forward. And Willie Ermine talks about this as being a sacred territory. The next slide, though, shows more of an operational thing. And we take advantage of it in a lot of our research, and I think it's well accepted, but it's that perspective of two-eyed seeing, of bringing the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing together with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and to use the two eyes together in a synergistic way. And this came from Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, but there's other expressions that are similar. Thanks. Let's go on now. And I want to get back to trauma. And trauma is an important thing, and it's certainly something that we need to be very aware of, and I think we all are in AVA and other organizations that deal with trauma of not just Indigenous women and girls, but a lot of people. So Maria Braveheart is an American Indian professor at Columbia. She's Lakota, who talks about historical trauma as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations. And the historical trauma, I mean, in her context, it's the American boarding school. In Canadian context, it's all of those things I talked about, not just the residential schools, but the 60s scoop, the foster care system that goes on even today, the criminal justice system that disproportionately affects Indigenous people, and the historical and ongoing gender issues that still affect Indigenous women and girls. So it's multiple, repeated, and chronic. And so in some ways, it goes even beyond some of the more well explored traumas, such as in Holocaust trauma. I mean, of course, those are terrible things, but they didn't last for generations. And I guess the view is that the multi-generational aspects of trauma, which do affect Indigenous people, are very important. And they generally lead to negative coping behaviors. And the ways around them then have to be through understandings of strength and resilience. So if you go on, Jason, I guess I'm now going to get to what I hope is going to be the most important. Please, the next slide, Jason. Yeah. So this slide and the next one are just some quotes about Indigenous understandings of strength. And this one comes from an Indigenous, an elder grandmother, as she's called, from Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Alberta. And by the way, almost any Indigenous person who's called an elder would likely not call themselves an elder. You're not, you're almost never an elder if you designate yourself as an elder. It's the community that needs to consider you an elder. So I don't know Doreen Spence, but I think that would probably apply to almost any Indigenous elder that we might encounter. So she talks about strengths as a way of being through relationships. I am happy to share these slides with everyone, so you don't have to furiously take notes, but you're welcome to do screenshots. Anyway, she finishes that there's a rich legacy of strengths that continues today, and strengths are not a list of things to achieve. They're based on their natural laws on how we need to live in a good way. Next slide, please. This quote comes from a Blackfoot elder from Siksika, which is just east of Calgary. And he talks about the strengths in our actions, looking, listening, and learning. And you'll hear that often from Indigenous people. It's very important that we look and we listen before we learn, and ultimately, certainly before we act. We need to observe. And that was our traditional way of learning, by looking and listening. And then the observation, the actions came later. And the strengths are the good actions of how we live and treat each other. And he goes on to talk about our responsibilities to teach this to the young people. So we need to listen, especially to the old ones, and to pass on that knowledge that we gain to the next generation. Next slide, please. This slide and the next one talks about resilience. And again, resilience is very important, and there's a lot written about this, but the middle paragraph, in a way, is important, that Indigenous resilience starts in the land. The land provides Indigenous people with sustenance, protection, community interaction spaces, and spiritual health. So you'll hear a lot about land-based healing, land-based learning for education, and these are very important things. And some of our most successful healing programs these days are ones that take place out on the land. And for many Indigenous people, it's a reconnection with that land because they may have had that connection broken by the past history. Next slide, please. So this goes on. Caring for the land involves a profound land-based knowledge to understand the cycles of nature. I am still learning about land. I did learn as a child from my father, who learned from his father, who learned from his grandfather, and so on. But uh, many of our Indigenous people didn't have this growing up, and therefore we need to help them regain this knowledge and regain this resilient sense that's important. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So what I'm trying to get at is that there's a holism to this. There's a positive aspects as well as negative aspects. We as researchers have tended to focus on the negative, and in some ways rightly so, because there's so much of that. You could say it's even the majority. And in this diagram, I mean, I do have a more active version where the petals of the flower come apart. But if you start in the upper right part, underlying everything is racism and colonialism, and probably the term to use is coloniality. And you could look that up on Google, but this is the colonialism that still exists, that ongoing colonialism, if you like, that's at the heart of the problem. But out of that, then are more specific aspects. And in Canada, that included residential schools, the 60s scoop, the foster care, and even the criminal justice system that continues today. And then because of a lot of these things, so many of our people have poor socioeconomic status, SES, poor housing, food insecurity. These are the proximal determinants of health. But if you just look at those and don't understand the underlying things underneath them and the underlying determinants below that, you don't really understand the context. But ultimately, these proximal determinants of health result in those disconnections and disruptions that actually lead to ill health and poor health behaviors. And ultimately, it leads to despair and diseases. But on the other hand, you have strengths, and those lead to health, healing, and wellness. And I've written those in either white or black. And uh, underlying all of it is this sense of indigeneity, a sense of identity. There's a famous Maori, a native New Zealander named Mason Dury, who wrote about positive identity having a positive effect on Maori youth health. And his work, although it specifically related to Maori in New Zealand, has great applicability to the Indigenous world in general. And a lot of the successful healing, the preventive health deals with instilling a positive identity in our Indigenous youth. It's important that the sense of self-determination be there. We need those relationships with the past and relationships with the future, the connections with elders and with youth, and this cultural connectivity that are all important to positive health, healing, and wellness. Next slide. So you've probably seen pictures like this. This is the American version, which, as far as I understand, came earlier, and I won't spend a lot of, but essentially it's a power wheel, and people at the middle are generally people who are looking like me. Well, they're not generally Indigenous Americans. They're white middle class Americans, male, and you can see that no matter which direction you go to more vulnerable people, disabled, poor, othered, sheltered, homeless, people with poor access, but it's all one directional out from the center. The center is the position of power. And so let's go on to the next one, because this is the Canadian version. And I think you've probably all seen this. It doesn't apply just to Indigenous people. You can see that there's an Indigenous component in the upper right of this, starting with colonizers, if you like, going to Indigenous people who are connected to their communities, and then Indigenous people who are disconnected. And that's a logical progression, but I would even posit that I'm much closer to the center of this. Maybe it's because of my Swiss mother growing up with two cultures, but I think that even more than being a colonizer, it's the other socioeconomic determinants that I grew up with. The fact that I grew up in a stable family. My father was university educated. He struggled to get there. But for my brother and myself, it was nothing because our father had done it. And so as teenagers, we saw him graduate. And then we very soon after went to university ourselves. And we were just like our white counterparts, if you like. I'm not really very fluent in French, but I manage, and I certainly own property. I have a house on an Indian reserve and benefit from that. So you can see that there's a lot of this that probably needs to be contextualized. And so I'm going to finish with the next two slides. And so this, if you actually click one more time, Jason, we'll go on to. So this is from a study from our graduate student. Well, she was a master's student in public health at the time. Now she's a PhD student working under Dr. Alexandra King. A. King is the second author of this. And it was a story specifically about hepatitis C, which is what Alexandra specializes in, and how Indigenous people are invisibilized in this wheel, talking about people with risk. So the largest risk factors, pardon the acronyms, it's people who inject drugs, PWID. So that's the largest risk factor for hepatitis C transmission. Of course, it affects people in prisons because they don't have access to safe ways to inject drugs, and they go ahead and do it anyway. And Hep C is rampant in our prisons, but also in our streets. You have youth, you've got men who have sex with men. It's not actually that important a vector for Hep C. It's much more important for HIV inmates. It might look that it's less important than the larger group of people who inject drugs, but you consider that there's a much smaller denominator here of people who are actually incarcerated at any given time. But none of these statistics actually incorporated Indigenous people. They weren't divided. But if you looked overall at the population of these various categories, collectively, about a third of the whole, I'm not sure if this is really a third, but it's a large percentage actually were Indigenous or are Indigenous. And the message is that you need to examine Indigenous people uh, as their own unit in any of these categorizations. You can't, because Indigenous people are in all of these categories, and if you separate them out this way on the left, you're missing out on an important aspect. Anyway, if you go on to the last slide, I'll spend a few minutes at this because this is, in a way, it's a complicated slide, but it talks about resilient strategies, and it's resilient strategies for wellness and healing. So this is what I was talking about with that flower diagram from a few slides ago. At the base of all of the issues are issues around colonization or coloniality that have ultimately led to things in Canada, the Indian Act, the residential schools, the 60 scoop. These cause biologic reactions, stress pathways, and Maria Braveheart in her research talks about these. These are real things. We know it from studies in rats. They're well known. If you expose pregnant rats to stresses of almost any kind, it affects their offspring even more than it affects them. But of course, we can't do these studies in humans, and we wouldn't, but we know that that's true. And certainly from an Indigenous point of view, and I think in a lot of other views, it's not just physical responses and mental responses, but emotional and spiritual. These stress biologic reactions cause spiritual wounds, emotional wounds, physical responses. that then lead to negative coping. And that includes things like drug use, alcohol use, but also disengagement and even metabolic syndrome, the precursors of diabetes. And ultimately, you have end manifestations, addictions, suicide, chronic diseases. And I've shown this as a great downward uh, descent, a downward spiral of increasing magnitude. I didn't attempt to show error bars on this, but there probably would be error bars of this nature. And so I'm not being excessively critical. I hope I'm not of these uh, uh, wellness wheels approaches because it does represent the majority, the healthy majority. Are the ones they're talking about, and the people who are more displaced, less engaged, and so on are down here near the bottom. But there are ways out of this downward spiral, and for people who are already in it, there are recovery initiatives, and I've mentioned some of them, and it's really a two-eyed approach to healing. There's Western ways, pharmaceuticals, counseling. Well, counseling can be both Indigenous or Western, or maybe a combination. But there's culture-based healing and land-based healing. And these are very important recovery initiatives. But we should also remember that there are resilience strategies. And these are very important for keeping our people healthy by preventing this downward spiral or keep it from happening too much. And they include connecting with land and culture through ceremony and spirituality, supporting positive identity. And I think that there are parallels for many cultures, not just Indigenous, in having a positive identity, knowing who you are and achieving and maintaining this holistic wellness. And finally, there's a role for all of us in here, including the white male people at the middle of these diagrams. We need to all take a part in societal reshaping. We need to support uh, addressing the inequities, the societal inequities that lead to poor health determinants, the reconciliation, and so on. So, with that, I would like to end. I thank you for your attention, and I appreciate the opportunity. Miigwech.
Right. Thank you. That was very, very interesting, fascinating. I was taking a bunch of screenshots at different times in your talk. Thank you so much, Dr. King. And just to say, I have a strong suspicion that some people that did want to join were unable to join due to the technical difficulties we had at the beginning. So we are going to be promoting the bejesus out of this over the next month because I think that it's terrific to share this knowledge, and we're really going to, with your permission, do a lot of promotion around people watching this after the fact.
Yeah,
So
you certainly have my permission, and you have my permission to share the PDF version of the slide deck. I'm happy to have that, and that's actually much smaller. It's only about 5 MB, so it's probably easily transmissible by email.
okay, terrific. Was wonderful news. Okay, great. Thanks so much. So now I would love to know if anyone has any questions for Dr. King. I'll just pause for a moment. I know I have a question, and maybe it's more of a conversation even, but I wonder if you could say more about how we understand these. This goes beyond adverse childhood experiences because that's one of the things we focus on in AVA is adverse childhood experiences. It's definitely intergenerational transmission of those traumas that lead to the the physical health outcomes. And one of our team members who's on the call actually is working on a paper right now looking at that. So I wonder if you would mind saying a bit more about what we understand about how intergenerational trauma impacts specific physical health outcomes, building on your own knowledge around cardiovascular health and that kind of thing would be really great to hear.
Well, I don't know that I have so much uh, to support it. I think it's an important topic. I am aware that there's probably a lot more on adverse childhood uh, trauma and its long-lasting effect on adult health. And there are even some American Indian studies that I think have
Mhm.
well established that that's the critical era. I'm not sure what they defined as childhood, but certainly, something less than probably 14 or 15, where if those adversities happen then, maybe it's because people are more susceptible or they're less resilient as young people. But it fits with what we know of the vast number of animal studies. I mentioned probably every psychology undergrad student is aware that if you stress the pregnant rat, it's the babies that are more affected than the rat mother herself. She recovers from the stress, even though she's the primary recipient, and it's the offspring. And I think there's enough information in the animal world research that says it even extends to grandchildren, rat grandchildren. So it shouldn't be a surprise to human researchers that uh, adverse child experiences. But I guess where we do have um, some evidence, at least in the animal research world, is in that intergenerational trauma, because I think it's fairly well established in studies in experimental animals that these uh, changes can be transmitted at least to another generation, if not beyond. And so there's evidence for multi-generational trauma, but uh, certainly you you do hear, and so again, I think it's not just Indigenous children in United States and Canada, but probably applies to various other populations where people have had multiple generations still under the same kind of stress, the traumas. And I don't want to get political, but I think some of the people that we're talking about. And, uh, and it's not just a single country. There's several countries where this is unfortunately ongoing.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, there's lots of examples today and through history. I remember hearing an Indigenous speaker talking about trauma and the Irish people as a great example. Irish for generations. The reputation of being prone to alcoholism and stuff like that. And I don't think it's quite the same today. They definitely have demonstrated resilience, but hearing the same kind of repression and they were prevented from going to school and some of the just an example that would be relevant to a lot of colonizing settler Canadians, that you see it in more than you see it in all kinds of cultures and because people are people, right? And
Yeah.
anyway, great. Oh, and I see we have another question here. Have epigenetics or plans for epigenetic studies been completed on health outcomes related directly or indirectly to multi-generational trauma? So yes, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? We talk about
Yes.
how it's transmitted through the epigenetics um, of exposure. Can you speak to that a bit, Dr. King?
Well, it's probably not easy to do any kind of epigenetic study on humans, never mind the difficulties that there would be, getting permissions with, to carry out this research with Indigenous populations. So I think most of what we know is from animal studies, where you might even question the ethics of working with pregnant rats, but those studies have been carried out, and as far as I know, that's the firm evidence that multi-generational effects occur with single generation trauma. And what I referred to actually is multi-generational trauma, where the trauma itself continues generation after generation. And I don't know that even the animal researchers have explored that. It's probably something that still should be done to look for those epigenetic changes and I guess the question that I would be asking as a researcher is the epigenetic change magnified or amplified with the second and then with the third generation of the same trauma versus just a single shot of it? And I'm speaking as a former basic scientist. I spent the first half of my career as a laboratory scientist in respiratory disease before becoming, I think I was just in transition when we first met, Nicole.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, these are great questions, and you're right. Traumatizing rodents and so on. It's questionable even then, but there is a lot to be learned, and particularly around resilience too.
Yes.
Um,
I
yeah,
mean, the reason for doing the experiments, in my view, would be to look for ways of overcoming the epigenetic changes. Are they reversible? And if so, what mechanisms? I mean, that would justify
yeah.
that kind of research as far as I'm concerned. But I would rather have it done on a group of rats than on my own grandchildren.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's for certain. All right. It's totally resonant with the kind of work that we're trying to do within AVA and outside of AVA, because we have the apron cohort, which is this cohort of families. They're relatively low risk families, but even in a low risk cohort, there's always traumas and stuff. Unfortunately, it's the human condition. But we're looking for factors that might predict resilience or increase the likelihood of resilience in youth, as opposed to depression when they've been exposed to certain traumas and that kind of thing. So trying to look at that other side of the picture, and even reflecting the comment you made earlier that so often in science we look for we're looking at diseases and disorders, but we also need to look at things that can promote healthier outcomes, and resilience being a good marker of that. Any other questions? This is really intriguing.
Sure. I have a question.
Go
If
ahead, Stefan.
possible. Thanks, Malcolm, for the presentation. I was just wondering, based on your experience, how we can maybe best engage in research with different Indigenous groups and tribes without generalizing the findings across all the groups, realizing that although there's like some similarities in values and language at times or like ways of living, there's also a lot of differences.
Well, and maybe this is just my own personal view, but I think we need to do more for this kind of research to engage with the people who are closer to the centers of those wheels. The people who are largely not affected themselves and maybe not even so much affected in their families, although to be honest, almost every family, there's somebody who's affected. I mean, I had an uncle who was a hopeless alcoholic and eventually died of it, but he really had PTSD from the Second World War. It wasn't that he had been to residential school or anything like that, but in any case, he had PTSD, and even though he was my father's brother, they were very different. My father never touched alcohol, was, had a stable life and job, and my uncle was totally different. So within any family, you find people, but I do think we need to work at engaging the not just the community of people who are suffering inequities, but people in those Indigenous communities who think that they're free of them. Let's put it that way. And I take that seriously myself. I mean, I do look around at the Zoom screens and I see very few men. I think we need to have more men involved in AVA. And I'm not being critical, Nicole. I understand the dynamics, but if you ask me, then Stefan, how do we? Maybe that's something I can help with. I mean, I think of having moved back to my reserve. Got a I've had a chance to join a men's group led by a male elder who's teaching a bunch of young people how to make drums and things like that. And uh, it's not something I necessarily want to do, but I approve of what he's doing because he's not only teaching them about drum making, he's teaching them about respect for everyone, including females. And that we need more of that.
Totally
I mean,
agree.
and that's really nice to hear. Thank you. And it kind of makes me think as I'm like moving forward in my career to like wanting to start a cohort of queer parents and which I hope to have like two-spirited individuals. I think something I'm looking forward to is kind of like how we have on AVA, like these champions. But I also don't want to be like tokenizing or approaching people like without creating the relationships. But at times it can be hard to create the relationships when they're across the country. So um,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any input on that part too, but I think you kind of touched on it.
Well, I have to maybe do a little bit of an editorial. The the two-spirit term, in my view, and in the view of a lot of people, has been a bit hijacked by what really ought to be the indigiqueer terminology, because two-spirit is more than just men who have sex with men who who are Indigenous. It's people who have both male and female elements to their spirit, to their emotions, so that it doesn't necessarily imply anything sexual. And I know that there's a group of people who are trying to put a slash in that long string of terms, 2S, LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera. They're wanting 2S slash LGBTQ and respectfully asking the Indigenous queer community to describe themselves as that, if that's so. I'm maybe speaking out of turn. I'm sorry if I am, but I just bringing that up. It's something that's right now under debate within the Indigenous communities. Those of us who feel that they have both male and female characteristics, but don't have an attraction for Indigenous men or non-Indigenous ones, we feel we don't have a place otherwise.
Very interesting. Well, it's a great example of the kind of counsel you've given me over the years to Dr. King. So I'm sure, Stefan, if you reached out with questions like that, Dr. King can either help answer or put you in the direction of somebody that can, you know. You've
So,
been great. You've been great like that
yeah,
over the years for me, Malcolm.
yeah. Yelena has put up her hand.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Jelena.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. I am interested in doing research in foster and kinship care, and something that is frequently top of mind for me is the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care, which I know you were talking about. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what you see as the most important future directions to address the overrepresentation of children in care.
Well, probably the policy level at our provincial uh, social services departments. I mean, it's going to take a while for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities to be able to take over their own social services. And even then, there's probably issues. It's only going to be the First Nations who have the wherewithal who are going to be able to do it right away. But every provincial department of whatever it's called, social services, has that capability of uh, developing training and guidelines for their workers to ensure that Indigenous children who do end up in foster care have those connections with responsible adults. And we have to recognize the necessity in many cases of placing those children, Indigenous children, in safe environments. That we can't ignore that. But in the past, the children ended up with aunties and uncles or grandparents, and that was okay. But if that's not possible, then at least they have to have connections with those uh, community members so that but when they finally become adult, they're not totally estranged and looking. So I think that's possible through education of social workers, and probably needs. I have never had the chance to address a early social work class in a university, but there are social work people, I think, who should be addressing them and giving them the same kind of things that I give med students and MPH students.
Thank you.
Great question, Jelena. All right, any other questions from anyone? So we're almost at the end of our time.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I'm sorry that we got started off on a left foot or something like that. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but in any case, it's all worked out just fine. Thanks. And
Yeah,
yeah, by all means, do blast out the
we will.
material.
And congratulations on your big award that will be happening this month. We'll also be promoting that. I don't know if you want to say something about that just before we go.
Well, I'm honored to receive honorary doctorate of laws from York University on June 18th. We'll provide a link. I'll provide a link to it to Nicole and Jason, and yeah, uh, it honors my work. I guess particularly from the days of CHR when I was scientific director for 8 years and led the CHR in Indigenous people's health research.
Yeah, during a pivotal time, really, honestly. So,
Yeah, there's still a lot of work to do, though. And
oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
so,
Well, that's
anyway,
great. Well, congratulations on your award. The big reason we couldn't have you in a couple of weeks was because of the award. So thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been really terrific, a very attentive group. And I know that so many who will benefit from this content will be told about it so they can access it, over the next month during this special month to recognize Indigenous people in Canada, but also on AVA. It'll be part of our repository of materials. So thank you so much. It's been really a real pleasure, and all the best to you. We'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, thank you, Miigwech.
Miigwech.